with, for all our listeners and our readers, what do you publish at the History Press?
Well, it's going to shock you, but we do publish history books. So, and more besides. The way it splits down is I'd say that the majority of what we publish is history, but that has a sort of mixture of other things because there's a bit of a legacy to this because they did actually merge a lot of different imprints together. And so it's been put under the umbrella of the History Press. So you'll see a very broad range of history titles. A lot of it would split down into Victorian, you've got Tudor, a lot of World War One and Two kind of thing, a few contemporary things coming in. I mean, recently we published a book on the history of the 1990s, yeah, by James Brooks Smith. It's a very good book. It's called Accelerate. And the question actually arose around that, which is how, at what point is something deemed history? Is the 1990s time? Is it time to cover that period? I would say yes. So we do things like that. Then within that, because of some of the other things we do, we have a local history branch as well. So local press, where a slightly different team to mine deals with those books for regional history. And then we have books that cover things like transport. So if you're into submarines, planes, trains, and we do a lot of books on the Titanic. We celebrate the Titanic. We have things for the Titanic societies every April, which is when the fateful sinking of the ship. We've got a very impressive fine press edition that we published late last year. And that isn't available through ordinary retailers. That's only available direct. And so it costs £300.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And it's letterpress printed. So I actually met a copy for the first time when I was last in the office in Cheltenham a few weeks ago, and it's so gorgeous. I mean, if you're really into publishing, you really appreciate it. You appreciate the feel of it and the smell as well. It's so gorgeous, and it's got it contains letters and ephemera from the people who were actually on the Titanic. So it's very poignant and moving.
Before you were at the History Press, what were you doing? Were you in publishing? I think you mentioned you were in book selling a while back. Do you think that's quite an essential foundation if you're working in publishing?
Well, it's interesting because I think the way people get into publishing has changed quite a lot. And I watched it changing as I was working my own way through publishing. So, yeah, I started off in the book trade as a bookseller. And I was a central London bookseller in Bayswater for 2 years. And that was sort of a good sort of training ground for certain aspects of learning about publishing too, because that was very different. I think now a lot of the buying that bookshops do is centralized. Back when I was a bookseller, it was branch level. And so one of my big duties when I was a bookseller was seeing sales reps from all the different publishers, and they would sell in their books to me. So they had to pitch to me to get their books into my sections. Of course, the netbook agreement that we used to have, we don't have that anymore for standardizing pricing. And so people can do whatever they want. And so books became incredibly cheap, in terms of perception. And then, of course, ebooks came in. And so, yeah, I've seen a lot of change. And I don't think people will ever want to stop reading. I think formats might change, but people just love to immerse themselves in a good book. But it's a shame that you don't really get that book selling entry point in the same way that you used to. And I was really disgusted actually by all the unpaid internships that seem to come out as a solution. That to me is not a solution. It's what I think of as genteel slavery, basically. Yeah. And the fact that publishing tends to be London and Oxford centric, two incredibly expensive cities, to get started in. And we know that the pay scales in publishing at junior level aren't very high.
When we last spoke, you mentioned that you had a number of job losses over your time in publishing. How did you pick yourself back up, as it were, after those? And how do you think the industry treated those job losses?
Well, this is an interesting one because I remember being at, I think it was the first ever Women in Publishing event. And who was there? was it Deborah from The Guilty Feminist? I think she was speaking. Yes, it was the very first one. And I was again in between jobs at that point, but I thought I'd go along to it. It had tote bags, Grace. You got to go to a conference to get your tote bags, don't you? Never enough tote bags you can have. So very nice tote bag. So I went off to that event, and I remember talking to some people, and they were all talking about which publishers they work for. And I was like, well, I don't work for one at the moment. I've just lost my job. And I'm like, oh, that's terrible. And I remember one person was saying, oh, well, that doesn't, she goes, I think that happens more to the younger generation now. Because, if you're Gen X, say, I was like, I am Gen X. And she was like, oh, you went through all this redundant. What I would say, the thing about publishing is it's a very collegiate industry, and it's all about your contacts. So I would say to anybody coming into it, doesn't matter how comfortable you might feel in your job, start that networking. Now, networking is one of those words that can sort of set the fear of God into people, particularly if they're quite introverted. You don't need to worry about that, because networking isn't necessarily going out and being massively social. It's just about going to certain events and people who do what you do, and sort of talking to other people, like seniors in particular. So just making yourself a bit more visible, but not massively, but just keeping those connections. It's a very connected industry, and a lot happens through the people you know, and you never know when someone's going to come in handy. You just don't.
What is your favorite book or poem, or both, if you have one? What would you recommend to our readers and listeners?
Well, I've never had a favorite, because I just think it's too hard to choose out of all of my children. Can't have a favorite child, Grace. That would be cruel. But one of the poems I adore is Roger McGough's Summer with Monica. I don't know if you've ever read it. It's a long form poem, and it's often published in a little volume. It's amazing. So it takes you from the beginning of a love affair all the way through to the horrible end, when it all falls apart and becomes all sad. But the beginning is just so full of that sort of passion and everything, and then you see it starting to go wrong, and I think most of us have been through a journey like that, but it just depicts it so beautifully. It's so on point. He's such an incredibly talented poet, so I'd tell people to seek that one out. Seek out Summer with Monica.